Monuments Men and Women, let's talk about who they are because it's a bit of a strange name. These were men and women, museum directors, curators, art historians, architects. Some were artists themselves who had established careers. Many had families, some had kids. They were almost all were beyond the draft age. These guys' average age was around 40. And yet they felt they had an important contribution to make during World War II. And they volunteered for service to be a new kind of soldier, one charged with saving rather than destroying. The credit to the program really should be shared among President Roosevelt, who understood the importance of preserving culture, General Marshall, who is, in my view, the unsung hero of World War II, General Eisenhower, who made sure this order was implemented among his commanders in the field. The idea originated more so to this one person than any other, a guy named George Stout, who was a conservator of works of art at the Fogg Museum at Harvard. Stout was old enough he'd actually seen service the last year of World War I and followed closely the developments in Europe over the ensuing years between the wars. In particular, the developments of military technology used during the Spanish Civil War, and watched with great horror the invention of firebombing, and was convinced there was going to be a second war. And so he started writing pamphlets about how to protect cultural treasures from these new threats, even before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And it was his idea more than any other that was the one that was selected. Now, a lot of people oftentimes comment how great it was that we went to go and try and protect these works of art. Of course, there were thousands of people who will remain nameless who volunteered to do what they could to move works of art out of cities out of fear of Allied bombing and the fires that they would cause. And we're not talking about a million objects or a few million objects, but tens of millions of objects, because we talk about art and culture, but we're talking about the libraries that contain the accumulated knowledge of Western civilization, museum collections, but not just art museums, museum collections of all sorts, musical instruments and manuscripts, all things that mattered. People made a great effort to try and save. And the greatest impetus for creating a force of cultural preservationists, if you will, was that the fact that the Nazis were pummeling the Western allies with propaganda. And they had convinced so many people in Europe that the American and British forces were going to come land on the shores of Europe with their ships, load up Europe's culture, and take it back to the countries they came from. And a lot of people there believe this. So the effort to counter that propaganda was to have monuments officers on the ground that were effecting temporary repairs to places that were damaged, oftentimes by Allied bombing and later artillery, to soften up landing beaches to get the good guys there to try and defeat the bad guys. In the course of their efforts, and as these countries in Western Europe were liberated, it became very apparent the extraordinary premeditated looting by the Nazis, and that set them off on a new course, which was really art detectives involved in what I refer to as the greatest treasure hunt in history, trying to find tens of millions of cultural objects that the Nazis had looted and taken east to somewhere in the Reich. This wasn't the first time that someone had thought about protecting cultural treasures during war. That credit largely goes to an attorney named Lieber, who during the Civil War advised President Lincoln and the Union forces, and the Lieber Code was established that said it's not okay to deliberately attack cultural facilities, monuments, and other things. The Hague Convention in 1907 formalized this among nations. But the Monuments Men and Women effort during World War II was the first time an army had attempted on a comprehensive basis to actually implement these otherwise lofty platitudes with people in the field who risked their lives, and I should say 2 of whom were killed in combat, one of whom, the American, a man named Captain Walter Hutchhausen, is buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten, one of the cemeteries the American Battle Monuments Commission overseas with the support of the ABMF. When the war was over, their work was just beginning because they had found, as I mentioned, tens of thousands of objects and thousands of hiding places, salt mines, caves, castles, monasteries, any place that had volume storage space. And when the troops were coming home, they were trying to increase their numbers from a paltry 40 or so in Italy during the combat, but there were only 7 or 8 at the beginning of the invasion of Sicily, and about 70 or so in Western Europe. Again, there were only a dozen or so, a couple dozen following the Normandy landings. They ultimately had 350 or so from 14 different nations serve. It was initially an American and British operation, about 2/3 American, about 1/3 British. The women, of course, were not allowed to serve in the combat areas, so their role really picks up in May 45 when the war's over, but they do make a very important contribution. And they were in Europe until 1951, sorting through these works of art, trying to determine what country they were stolen from. And it was the policy of the Western Allies, very important to distinguish from the Soviets, to identify the country these things came from and return them to those countries so that, in theory, countries within those, commissions within those countries would identify who the rightful owner was in Netherlands, Belgium, France, or so on, whether it was a museum, a church, an individual, and then continue the effort to get it back to them. That worked okay in some countries. Other countries like Austria wringed their hands at the opportunity. Look at all this stuff we've got. This is great. This would be wonderful additions to our museum. And they were the poster boys of how not to do it. And some of that took decades for the lack of follow-through to surface. Remarkably, though, the monuments men, like other World War II veterans, didn't talk about what they did when they came back. They realized by the time I'd gotten to them in the early 2000s, talking to them, that was a mistake. They should have talked about it. But they, like other World War II veterans, realized 2 important things. The real heroes were the men and women, these 218,000 that are buried overseas that didn't come home, and the other 200,000 that were killed that did. They also realized that they all wanted to get on with their lives. It was a tremendous interruption to their lives. 3 years matters a lot to someone that maybe only has 20 left or so. And so during these wars you mentioned, no, there were not monuments officers. Civil affairs officers sometimes oversaw these things, but there wasn't the same concentrated effort, even though there was this 1954 Hague Convention that codified all sorts of rules concerning the protection of cultural treasures that was a consequence of what the monuments men and women did during the war. I do ask the question, what's the responsibility of an invading force to protect the cultural treasures, and not just the cultural treasures, but the cadastral, the tax records of the country? Because, we got it pretty easy here in the West. We don't think about paper so much now because everything's electronic. But 95% of the people in the world function off paper documents. And if those paper documents are destroyed, their society doesn't function. If it doesn't function, our soldiers can't leave. So I tell people, having monuments men and women today is an important thing to do, even if you could care less about why they're doing what they're doing. If you care about our men and women and you don't want to have more of them get sniped and killed, we need to get in these places and out of them as quickly as we can. And the more disrupted their society is, the longer we're going to be there and the more lives we're going to lose. So I'm proud to say, I think largely due to our efforts and the visibility that the film brought, which included the screening of the George Clooney Monuments Men film at the White House in 2014, that was attended by many people from DOD, from State Department, et cetera, that, and the work of other people that were pushing this thing. We now have monuments officers, 21st century monuments men and women.
Robert, when you talk about the art cultural heritage that were protected, was it things that were confiscated or things that were in plain air that were subject to, being at the bottom of a bomb or, just looted by the enemy or burned in a fire?
In Eastern Europe, which was, of course, where the war began, the Nazis looked at the Slavs, Poles, et cetera, as subhumans. These were areas that they were going to eliminate people, move them out of the way to create more space for Germany to expand. And therefore, subhuman people can't create things of beauty or intelligence. We just destroy it. There were some exceptions. In Poland, the big three, the Leonardo Lady with an Ermine, the Raphael Portrait of a Gentleman, and Rembrandt's Good Samaritan, they targeted those things. Those were looted within weeks of the invasion. And there were other exceptions, but for the most part, there was a lot that was destroyed. In the West, the Nazis intended to occupy the West. Paris was going to be a place that they went to go. It was going to be a playground. They also didn't have enough soldiers to fully occupy France. So the idea of going into the Louvre and walking out with the Mona Lisa, they knew that was going to inflame local tensions. They didn't do that. And what was the rush? The Reich's going to last 1,000 years. We want to have things that are pretty to look at. So when we go visit, they're there. In Italy, which was the subject of my third book, Saving Italy, about the monuments officers there and the Nazi looting, it was much more opportunistic in nature. The Italians, of course, were allies of Nazi Germany the first 3 years of the war. And only when the Italians changed sides were the Germans, they felt betrayed and backstabbed. And there were a lot of things in Italy that were in storage areas that were burned and destroyed because they were just pissed off. There were other things that were looted incidental to war, which has always happened. But it wasn't the premeditated looting of lists of things that German museum directors had gone into these countries before the invasion targeting, because, again, Italy was an ally, and Hitler greatly looked up to Mussolini. I know that seems hard to believe, but in fact, an interesting factoid of World War II. In 1925, Mussolini was Time magazine's Man of the Year. So, he's kind of a joke now when we talk about him, but he wasn't seen as a joke up until 1938 or 39. And Hitler was somewhat mesmerized by him and his ability to organize the country, et cetera. So they're very different kinds of problems, and that's a factor when we're trying to find missing things, where they are, were they looted, why were they looted? And then, of course, a lot of things were picked up by displaced persons, soldiers of all sides. American soldiers had picked things up as souvenirs. Some American soldiers did steal things. And so things are, of course, I'm completely skipped over Soviet Red Army that was taking anything and everything that they could, from toilet seats to file cabinets to whatever was in the file cabinets, train loads of cultural property, because they felt their country was destroyed.
Any idea where the Amber Room is?
In 1996, there was a newspaper article that's the lead was amber panels discovered. And what had ended up happening, for those of you that may have been to outside St. Petersburg to see Catherine Palace, where it's been completely rebuilt, there were paintings that were painted, if you will, using different shades of amber that were cut and sized to create the appearance of a painting. And only when you walked up to it could you see, no, it's not a painting, it's actually different shades of stone. These were the size of a painting. One person could lift it up, albeit heavy, and put it under their coat and walk off with it. There were 4 of them in the room. The amber panels themselves are 6 to 8 feet wide, 20 feet tall, and weigh multiple tons, and would have required dozens of people to lift one up if that was even possible. So one of these mosaics amber mosaics had been found and was showed up at an auction in Bremen. And the writer, in his inexactitude, said one of the amber panels has been found. Well, what had been found were one of these mosaics. And that, I think, breathed life into this idea that the amber panels are out there. I believe that they're destroyed. I think they were destroyed in a combat battle in Kaliningrad. The Germans were stuck in this castle. They pleaded with the Soviets on the other side that were lobbing in artillery. Hey, we got these amber panels. And, I'm sure it fell on the deaf ear of some uneducated commander over there. And then later, fessing up to mistakes with Joseph Stalin was a sure way to never collect your insurance benefits. So I don't think anybody was willing to admit this. And amber, of course, would burn up in a fire. It's a mineral. And I just think essentially there's a simple divide. If objects that are missing could have been carried by one or two people, I think there's a reasonable chance to think they may have survived. If they required more than one person, more than two for sure, to be moved around and hidden, I think it's highly unlikely they did survive, because the Soviet Red Army had 1 million troops there in Berlin and throughout Germany. They're looking for these things. I just think it makes for a great story. It's wonderful for movies, but I think it's unlikely that survived. There is currently an exploration going on in the North Sea with a sunken ship that people believe there are paintings on. I mean, it's a bit of it'll be a Pyrrhic victory if they turn out to be right. I don't know that there's reason. I mean, I wouldn't have mounted that kind of effort, because if they are paintings, they're all going to be destroyed. And so that's another subset of that question. If there are storage areas, is what's there become an artifact, or is it still an art object? There's about every few years we get the story about the train that's hidden in a mine in Poland. That makes for great media. And of course, you have to understand, a lot of these areas are poor, and they love it when the media shows up en masse, and they can sell T-shirts and the hotel rooms are full, and they're good intentions and big hopes. And I'm sure that we're going to continue to find things. And I think the next 5 to 10 years is the really critical year, because sadly, in that time period, we're going to lose the rest of the World War II generation. We're going to lose all the rest of the soldiers. My 5 and 7-year-old are going to grow up and never have known a World War II veteran, which is a sad thing in my view. In 2013, there was a discovery of the Gerlich collection in Munich that had several thousand works of art that no one had seen since the war. The press, again, in their inexactitude, said 2,000 stolen works of art. It turned out there were about 14 that were looted, and those have been identified and are in the process of being restituted. There were a number of works of art that were, if you want to say it this way, looted out of German museums on the orders of Adolf Hitler. And this dealer was supposed to sell them, and he chose not to. So, lucky him or lucky his heirs that they got them. Now, lucky that they're in a museum in Switzerland. And it's the great loss of the German people that Hitler did that. But I think we'll find some things and be surprised. And I think when it happens, it's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. In essence, the monuments, men and women of the United States and Great Britain during World War II set the high bar for the protection of cultural property during conflict. And then we ceded it by doing nothing over all those years. And Italy picked up the mantle in 1969, to the extent that as other countries were starting to create some sort of cultural police force, they sent their candidates to Italy, to go through their training programs, including the art looting guys and gals that are at the FBI and ICE officials, Immigration Customs Enforcement. So in the United States, I'm proud to say there are some great men and women that work at the FBI in their art looting investigation unit. We have an outstanding relationship with them, and they do really important work. A lot of their work deals with frauds, because it's a chance to stop a crime before it actually takes place where people get bilked out of their money buying something that is fraudulently created. The Carabinieri also spends a lot of time on frauds.
But there's no multilateral organization like the UN that does.
Interpol does oversee this along with other crimes. State Department is really a non-factor as far as pursuing these things. They're certainly involved in issues of cultural heritage, but they're always in attendance at our return ceremonies overseas. But I think our main policing forces in this country are FBI and ICE.
Whether there was an equivalent group of monuments men in the Pacific Theater dealing with the Japanese looting of Chinese artifacts.
Yes, there was. That gets less attention. Part of the reason is you can't have monuments, men and women, on the ground until you have combat soldiers on the ground. And we didn't have combat soldiers in Japan until the war was over, after the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. But once that did happen, once again, enter stage left our hero, George Stout, who, as I mentioned, was the father of this idea. Not only the father of it, he landed on Normandy D+30 or so, I believe, with their whopping force of 7 guys, and embarked on their efforts to try and do this job with very little support from the Army. They had a job to do, but excuse me, they were hitchhiking their way across Europe. They didn't have any vehicles. They didn't have any cameras. When they got cameras, they didn't have any film. But because they were used to having big jobs with no resources, they improvised and were very, very effective. So Stout, after the discovery in the summer of 1945 of the last major repository, which contained works of art that were destined for Hitler's museum in Linz, he was pretty fed up. He'd been gone 2 years. He'd taken off 1 day in 2 years. He came back to the United States and then stayed a matter of months before he went to Japan. Even though he said he was going to do that, he went to Japan and he set up the operation there. We had about 8 guys, plus 8 Americans, and there were about a dozen or so British Commonwealth monuments officers that understood those parts of the world better than most Americans, in Thailand and Burma, in the Vietnam area, etc., the Indochina, Asia area. And they were really trying to protect works of art from theft or destruction by Allied forces, and then went through and did look at some of the looting by Japan of those countries that have been conquered. The thing I'm most experienced with in the last couple of years is the opening of the Berla collection in Zurich, which is a collection of a man named Emil Berla, who was a Swiss industrialist who, without question, acquired a great deal of his wealth buying plants and factories and properties, in many cases from Jews that needed to sell. There are accusations of use of slave labor at some of these factories. He also acquired an immense and extraordinary art collection, again, from many people that needed to sell, and no one cared. People looked the other way back then. Some of those works of art after the war, there were claims on them. He had to fess up to those and purchase them, paid for them again, if you will, but of course at those prices in the 1940s and 50s. But there are ongoing claims against certain works in his collection and it's expanded. It's having to address an expanded issue of what is looted. Is a Jew that was able to get out of Nazi Germany, but he got out by virtue of selling a painting to fund him getting out, but he voluntarily sold it at whatever price he could get. Is that a case of for sale? or is a Jew who was, and I'm talking about Jews because they were so deliberately targeted, is a Jew that's living in Switzerland across the border from Germany, contiguous to it, who sells something because the Germans, the Nazi Germany has Aryanized his businesses in Germany, has closed his bank accounts, has created all sorts of bogus taxes for all the effort they had to put into this, who sells something to put food on the table. Is that a forced sale? As it's referred to now, I think appropriately, loss of assets due to persecution. And so we're now having these other kinds of cases surface. And what's happening in the big picture, if we step away from it at the 30,000-foot view, is a more moral analysis of what's right. There are some cases, I'm sad to say, of opportunism on the part of, in some cases, attorneys, on the part of some claimants to file claims because it's the value of these works of art has gone up so astronomically. And sometimes they're bad cases, and that makes it much harder for the people with good cases to recover their works of art. I think that the moral arc's moving in the right direction, and we're now seeing it expand from Nazi-looted art, which I think's in the seventh inning, to use a baseball analogy, to works of art from third world countries that were removed, taken under agreements or not agreements in the 19th and 20th centuries as part of the colonialism of the world. Now those third world countries are coming to the communal table and saying, hey, we have museums. We don't have any of our stuff in our museums because it's all in yours. We're in the first inning of that. This issue of who owns these things or what's the right thing to do is something now the world's only beginning to grapple with at the Met, at the British Museum in London, at the Louvre in Paris, and so many other museums, Belgium in particular. And sometimes the answers, if we live in the world of the court of public opinion, which is the most important judicial forum in my view, sometimes these things need to be resolved with that in mind, which means we may need to find a solution that's not a litigious or judicial solution, but one that's morally driven.
When you look at Ukraine, obviously no foreign state is in the Ukraine helping to preserve the art. And just from the pictures that we see every day, there's just utter destruction. Is there any effort to protect the works of art, or are they just going to be destroyed?
If I showed you photos of black and white photos of some of the efforts to protect works of art in Ukraine with some of the black and white photos from World War II, you wouldn't know the difference. Because if you have a statue in the center of a square that is, short of having a crane you can't move, then all you can do is put sandbags and scaffolding there to protect it. And that's exactly what the Italians did to so many things in Italy. The paintings, for the most part, that they could move, they've moved to the western part of the country. They adopted kind of the attitude of Winston Churchill during the war, which is no painting leaves these islands. So they've not moved them out of the country, but they've hidden them in mines and areas in the western part of the country. But Russia, in my view, as I said earlier, like the United States did in Iraq, has an absolute responsibility to protect those things, but they're not protecting them, they're targeting them. There shouldn't be a surprise when people start getting murdered and these genocides or Holocausts, lower H or capital H, start happening, because we always get warning signs. The bad guys don't kill people right away. They go in and destroy their cultural heritage. What gets left out of the discussion, in my view, about Holocaust and genocide is the humiliation part. We want you to be alive to watch us do this. You're going to be helpless. There's going to be nothing left of you. This is certainly what the Nazis did. They didn't start murdering people right away. They stripped them of their property laws. They changed the laws. They confiscated their assets. Then they stole things. In the West, they tried to be clever. They tried to make it look like we're doing it all legitimately by changing what the laws were. In the East, they just took it. Yes, they incarcerate people. Then they work them to death. They murder them. They do all these things. But it's like a cat with a snake. The cat didn't kill the snake right away. It tosses it in the air. It plays with it. It gnaws at it. It's going to die. But when we see Taliban go into Mali and burn Islamic texts, because they're being venerated, they're in a case, people are looking up to them, or ISIS does what it does in Palmyra or other areas, or the Taliban blows up the Bamiyan Buddhas because they're being venerated. You know what's coming. There's no surprise here. So anytime the United States or other countries express shock and dismay that people are being murdered, it's like, there was a knock on the door and FedEx showed up with a message, and it's the same message that's happened at conflict over and over and over again, which is why we need to be paying more attention to this. The United States monuments men and women are advising with using some of their extraordinary now technological tools to monitor from space some of the things that are going on. But without boots on the ground, this is why it worked during World War II. We had a commanding presence and we had force protection. And even then, 2 monuments officers were killed in combat. And sadly, I think the optics of any of our monuments men and women wearing an American military uniform in Ukraine doing anything, humanitarian work, protecting cultural treasures, is a optic and soundbite for the bad guys to say, the American army is here now. They're in Ukraine. And that's just a red line, I think, that is too perilous to cross, as painful as it is to watch what's taking place. It's one of the reasons the monuments men and women had architects, because they knew which buildings were the most important, and they advised Allied commanders on what to steer away from on bombing. And in fact, probably the most precise bombing mission of World War II took place in Florence, where I lived for a number of years, because they wanted to bomb the rail yards. It was a transit point for ammunition, materiel, and troops headed south to fight in Rome and further south from there. I mean, imagine dropping a bomb on anything in Florence. And for those of you that have been to Florence and have arrived at Santa Maria Novella train station, Santa Maria Novella Church, which is the only Renaissance church there, is a pre-Renaissance, is 450 feet away from where the train station is. And we dropped bombs and knocked out the rail yard and didn't damage anything other than the rail yard. But for the most part, bombing during World War II, these bombing of aircraft carriers out in the Pacific, hell, if we hit the water, it was a good thing. Hitting the boat, not easy. So it was just an imprecise inexactitude, which is why we dropped so many bombs. But we actually were able to do it in Florence on that one occasion. Of course, the risk was so grave had we made mistakes. Is our worth a life? And you might think, because of our efforts and all the books and the 20 years of my life I've given to this, et cetera, the answer is obviously yes. But Dean Keller, the monuments man, the senior monuments officer in Italy, who was an artist, he was a professor of drawing at Yale. He was the unofficial portrait painter at Yale. Said, no work of art is worth the life of a single American boy. But he also said, risking your life for a cause is absolutely worth it. What Dean Keller said is the right way to be looking at it. These guys didn't want to risk their lives and didn't want to get killed. Walter Hutchhausen, that's buried in Margraten, didn't want to be buried there. He wanted to come home. Sadly, he died a month before the war was over. He made it almost the whole way. But were they willing to risk their lives for a cause, which was the preservation of these things of beauty and knowledge that enrich our lives, that are the reasons that we work? Yes, that's worth it. I want to put in a short plug here, really less about what I'm doing than the important work of the American Battle Monuments Foundation, and also the American Battle Monuments Commission. And happily, we've approached by coincidence a convergence of objectives here, because I am now personally, outside my work with the Monuments Men Foundation, where I volunteer all of my time, working on a new book about the American cemetery, the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten. And I hope through our efforts and the relationships we are continuing to develop with the ABMF and ABMC and other people of goodwill and organizations, that this book will do for the United States, and I hope the world, what Monuments Men and the film have done to raise the world global awareness of who the Monuments Men and women were and the importance of cultural preservation. I dare say few people in the United States even know we have overseas cemeteries, and fewer still know the names of them or how they came into being, much less any of the men and women that are buried there. And I must say I was woefully ignorant to the extent I should have been 6 years ago when I started learning more about this under the same type curiosity circumstances that led me into the Monuments Men and Women. But there's not ever been a book or a film, short of academic tomes, that have tried to reach the broad public and tell a narrative story that involves our cemetery, one of our cemeteries. And I hope that's what we accomplish. That's what we're trying to do. And it's a very, very, very difficult task, maybe more so than Monuments Men, because in the case of Margraten, we have 8,301 boys and 4 women that all come from different backgrounds and don't have any connection other than they fought for the United States and they're all buried in the same place. So trying to find a narrative thread there has not been easy, but we have it. And it's a modern day story that takes us back to the creation of the cemetery, and I think shines a magnificent light on a part of our country's heritage, much like Monuments Men and Women. We should be immensely proud of the untiring effort of the United States government to find every missing soldier, airman, and make sure that they were properly buried, either in the cemetery or allowed to come home. And the work of the commission to maintain these cemeteries is breathtaking to witness. The work of Jim Rossner and his board to raise funds to further the work of making sure people are aware of this. All the people that work at these cemeteries, I mean, it's just an awe-inspiring thing to go and visit and see them and know about this legacy. And I want all Americans to know about this story through Margraten. We can't tell every cemetery story, but if we can tell one that everyone gets it, they'll be curious about all of them. And that's what our objective is. And I hope the book should be out late next year. And it's one of the great experiences of my life to learn about these men and women and be able to write about them. Very, very proud about that.
Well, thank you very much, Robert Edsel, and thank you, the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, for a great program. Thank each one of you for joining us, and hope you found this as interesting and informative as I did.